All right, so now we get to look at a full-fledged moral theory. Utilitarianism does have some problems, but it is a coherent theory. It gives you clear answers, and so let's look at it. So first we can ask, what is the basic duty of a utilitarian? And now we have a singular principle, pretty handy. So let me read, right? So this is a nice short reading. So I have the one-page excerpt from John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. I'm starting at the very, very beginning. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure, and the absence of pain; by unhappiness, pain, and the privation or lack of pleasure. Most simply, the utilitarian has done the right thing. If you're following a utilitarian moral theory, you've done the right thing if you produce the most happiness. Period. This means the most happiness in the world. We'll get into some of the details. This isn't just saying, if I have two choices, I need to do the one that produces the most happiness. No, it's more general and broad than that. You need to always be producing the most happiness in the world as you can. Not just, oh, I'm thinking of this or this, that one makes me happier, so that's the one. No. If you look up utilitarianism online because you're trying to cheat on one of my quizzes or something, well, watch out, because you're going to find these kind of odd formulas. Now, I will produce a little bit of a formula and we'll tinker with it, and this is part of the problem. But you're going to find some formulas that don't really make as general of sense as just thinking of producing the most happiness. So if you see a formula that says, utilitarianism seeks to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, of course, that should mean the very broad thing I just said, but people might misunderstand this as saying, oh, to do the right thing, I produce happiness for the greatest number of people. So if I have some money, I should give as many people a penny, give 1 million people a penny. That's not really how this would work. I mean, would that really produce the most happiness in the world than some other option? Like giving money to the people that most desperately need it or something? You get the idea. The next misconception is one that Mill directly addresses, and it's this idea of defining happiness. He jumps right in and says, I mean pleasure by happiness, and by unhappiness I mean pain. Now, if you were going to just ridicule this and try to turn it into a straw man, you would say, oh, well, pleasure is so basic. That is not a very complicated concept. Humans should aspire to be much more than just tickling creatures or something. Well, he addresses this. What he is getting at is his conception of pleasure versus pain admits of degree or admits of quality. Now, because I'm a goofball, I call this the porn versus poetry dilemma. If all we are seeking is happiness, then just go around tickling people or handing around porn. There we go, we've given people pleasure. No, so let's let him say it more directly. He says, and now I'm in the probably 2/3 down the second paragraph. It's all a single page, so the second paragraph, 2/3 of the way down that paragraph. The comparison of the Epicurean, that's just the life that seeks pleasure, the comparison of the Epicurean life to that of beast is felt as degrading, precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. Let me explain. Let's read a little farther. So skip 4 more lines. Now we're at the start of the 3rd paragraph. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feelings of moral obligations to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. Now it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. All right, let's unpack this. So first he's going to say, do not try to mock me by giving some simplistic idea of pleasure and say the moral thing to do is to seek that kind of pleasure. No, there are vast levels of pleasure. So go to the famous kind of paraphrase quote. It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Here's the idea. Yes, if all you need to be happy is some warm mud and some good various slop, you would say, hey, what's the deal? I mean, ignorance is bliss. The pig seems much happier than most humans do, so now I know what to do. I just need to go get porn and tickles, right? No, he's saying humans have a lot more various ways of acquiring pleasure. We have higher faculties. And so he's giving us this little way to test it. If you take someone who has experienced all these different levels of pleasure and we ask them which is the best, if they are truly experiencing all these manners, he would say they would always opt for the higher level pleasure. They would always opt for poetry or romance over porn and tickling. And so that's how we can tell what is the best. And he kind of stacks the deck here, because he says, if anyone would say, nope, I would take tickling over a romantic relationship anytime, then they truly haven't experienced a real romantic relationship. They don't really, here would be true of me, they haven't really felt the full experience and joys of poetry if they would choose porn every time. Now, I could say, I'm not that good. I don't have much of an aesthetic sense, so I'm not the best when it comes to how great of a joy does poetry bring, but I can still accept his point. Is a romantic relationship better than another one that only involves the beastly pleasures of mud and good slop? Yes, I've experienced both, and so you could say I'm a good source here, and yes, a long, loving relationship is better than porn. Good. So we would need to keep that in mind as we're seeing how do I produce the most happiness? Well, you need to always give a preference for the happiness that involves higher faculties, higher qualities of happiness. And so let me actually read the text itself. So third paragraph, last few lines of the third paragraph. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they've only known their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So, yes, if I don't understand poetry and I say it's not that big of a deal, well, I could find someone that fully appreciates it, and I would have to take their word for it because I haven't appreciated it as much as I could, right? All right, so the next qualifier we should ask, whose happiness is the greatest happiness principle concerned with? If there is a choice between making oneself happy and making others happy, how do we weigh these decisions? So let's look. So now I am in the very last paragraph of the piece. Quote, I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. So now notice, if we were to go to one extreme, you might make the mistake of saying, well, I should make others happy and not myself. Well, no, that's going too far to the other way, because you would say, your happiness matters as much as anyone else's. Now, of course, most people are going to make the mistake the other way. They're going to consider their happiness because they have the greatest access to it, when really your happiness shouldn't matter as much as anyone else's, but it should matter equally. And then that's it. That is the whole theory. As with a lot of these moral theories, they're really going to come down to understanding them in examples. Theory is one thing. I need to make sure you know how to apply this so that when we get to the contemporary moral issues we'll look at, you can directly apply these very carefully. When we start to apply this to examples, that's when you get what is both a pro and a con of utilitarianism. The pro is, well, it seems like we can just give a rough calculation of what action produces the most happiness, and we have a clear answer of what the right thing to do is. Sure, but the con is, morality is pretty hard to make it into such a strict calculation. I mean, let's be careful. What are the kinds of things you would have to consider if you were trying to make this a calculation? Well, first, you need to consider how many people are affected by your action and how much happiness they gain or lose for each person. And when we're keeping that calculation together, we also have to consider, notice, the quality of the pleasure that each one experiences. What else should we consider? The duration of the pleasure. I mean, if you were to find someone that's tragically homeless and you would say, I know, I'll put them up into a Ritz-Carlton hotel for a night and man, that will make them happy. Well, you would say, no, it's going to be very short term. Sure, it might be high in quantity of pleasure and maybe high in quality as well, but one night and then they go back to having a harsh life. If I give a hungry person a glorious meal for one day, sure, high quality, but the duration is low if they're going to be starving every day after that. So again, we keep this in mind. But so if you were to attempt some sort of calculation, you would what? Have 4 elements. The number of people affected, the quantity of pleasure each one experiences, the duration of that pleasure, and the quality of that pleasure. Yes, if you look online, you will see people try to put pleasure into some kind of unit, sometimes even called hedons. Right? It's so funny. Hedonism is the idea that we should seek pleasure, and so they make these units, right, like dollars of happiness called units of hedons. And so you could say, ooh, a loving relationship is worth this many hedons, eating a gummy bear is worth this many hedons. Okay, you get the point. So this is going to come into our heads when we're thinking of these dilemmas, what we should do, but let's try to keep this under control. All right. The classic utilitarian example is what is known as the trolley problem. Now, we don't think of trolleys, we normally think of trains, but here it is. Basically, you find yourself on a runaway train. You cannot, the brakes are not working, you can't get it to slow down. All you can do is change what track it diverts to. And of course, you all know what's coming. If I go down this track, I'm going to run into one person. And if I go down this track, I'm going to run into 4 people, right? Well, what should you do? Well, obviously, we're trying to reduce the amount of pain, increase happiness where we can. So, utilitarian calculation, well, you divert the track to kill one person as opposed to a multiple of people. Classic stuff. But even in a tragic case like this, we can see that things could get more complicated in the real world, and so we need to make sure this is a subtle theory. So, for example, what if on one side of the track is your dear sweet granny, and on the other side of the track are 4 toddlers that you've never met in your life? Now, again, if this is a simple case, we would say, oh gosh, those toddlers have a whole life of experiences and pleasures like still to come. My granny, even though I feel a lot about her, well, notice, think of all the people that will be affected by the death of these toddlers. If we add up those numbers, hey, maybe granny's on TikTok and people love her oatmeal cookie recipes on TikTok or something, but we would still say, no, right, her life is near the end of her joyful experiences. We have to try to predict the future, notice. We would have to assume that those toddlers would bring much more pleasure. Now, of course, I know how you people are. Right now you are saying, hey, what if Granny is about to cure cancer? And what if those 4 toddlers are going to be the next Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Charles Manson? We don't know, right? Of course. This is going to be a problem. We'll talk about it. But you would still say, if we are making our best reasonable prediction, this is all terrible, but in order to produce the least amount of pain and unhappiness in the world, we would divert the train. And sorry, Granny has made her last oatmeal cookie. God damn it. Next example, and let me try to trick you with this one. You have just gotten invited to an all-night rave, and you do know that Jeff's quiz is the next day. Now, what should you do? Should you stay home so you're well rested and ace Jeff's next quiz, or should you go to the rave? I know raves aren't that popular anymore, but come on, I just love that word. What should you do? Should you attend the rave or get a good night's sleep so you can ace Jeff's quiz? Well, notice, I've created a false dichotomy. In full-born utilitarianism, if you're really trying to be a good person and follow this moral theory, you would probably do neither of those things. You can produce much more happiness in other ways. Again, so don't fall to this idea that, okay, I've got two choices, now what would a utilitarian do? A real utilitarian would look at all the multiple choices. So they would probably do some nice things, produce some happiness for themselves and others, and get enough rest so they still do well in the quiz. All right, now let's take another case. This case isn't supposed to be very deep. It is just supposed to point out a possible problem or oversimplification. All right, so let's say that you find yourself with a Snickers bar. All right, you have a Snickers bar. Now, you also find that I'm going to try to be a full-fledged utilitarian with this Snickers bar. What should I do? Now, of course, one basic misconception or oversimplification would be to say, well, I need to produce the most happiness for the most number of people, so I'm going to chop this Snickers bar into tiny, tiny bits and give it to 100 people. There, I made 100 people happy. I did my utilitarian duty. No, that's not the best thing to do, because now we have to consider how people experience happiness. For instance, if I divided this candy bar into 100 little pieces, you would say every person that got that little tiny morsel is going to experience the tiny little bit of happiness, and a lot of you would be frustrated. Oh, I kind of tasted Snickers bar, and now I'm frustrated because I want more, and there's no more. Sure. But we would also experience the different contexts and different experiences people have. For instance, I'm not a huge fan of chocolate, so it wouldn't give me a ton of pleasure. So you'd probably be better off giving my portion to someone else and making it a bigger portion instead of these 100 little bits. So maybe there is someone around you that just is euphoric over Snickers bars. It's their favorite food on the planet. And so you could imagine, well, if I'm talking that kind of a scenario, maybe I should even give that whole thing to them because it brings them a lot of happiness than giving some little pieces to 100 Jeffs who don't care much for chocolate compared to this fetishistic person who's almost orgasmic when they have a Snickers bar. You get the idea. It's not this basic simple calculation. You have to consider how things affect different people and what situations they're in. I know. Now you're starting to see that aren't we almost going to be paralyzed when we try to consider all our options? Yes, that is how it could get ridiculous, so we want to try to stave off that kind of obsessiveness as much as we can when considering this. Alright, so let's try one more corny example before we get to some real moral theory examples that we're going to apply to every moral theory. So one more corny one. Again, these examples aren't supposed to solve life's riddles. They're just supposed to help to clarify what utilitarianism means and how to apply it. All right, so let's try this. This is so dumb, right? So please feel free to skip this one unless you just have the most immature sense of humor like I do. Oh my gosh, there's a few of you that find this stuff funny, and oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for your loved ones. They have to put up with your sense of humor if it's like mine. Okay, so here, let's look at this. All right, so let's say you are the biggest fan of some muscle-bound movie star, right? Vin Diesel, John Cena, what else? I'm sorry, The Rock. Biggest fan of The Rock, right? Good? All right. Now, what you have done is you've entered some contest where you get to go on a Jumanji-like adventure with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. I'll just say The Rock from now on. Good. So, you and a few of your friends, you get invited, and you're going on this hiking journey with The Rock, and everything's going really, really well. Good? Now, you take a little break, you're getting out of the sun, and so you go into this little cave right? And they've handed out sandwiches, and this is just a great day of your life. I mean, happiness points just through the roof because you are just a fairly simple-minded movie fan. And The Rock seems like a sweetest guy. Good. So, you're all sitting down and having lunch, and he asks, okay, so how's this experience for you? Is everything going as you foresaw it, right? And you say, this is great, Rock. You are just such a good guy, but I do have one request. Rock says, all right, let's see what I can do. You say, what I really want to see is I want to see you say some of your most iconic movie lines, right? And I want to see you kind of get into the character, right? So, shirt off, show your tattoos, and say all that cool lines from Fast and Furious and all that stuff. I'm telling you, you don't have to, but that would be the coolest thing you could do. All right, no problem. So The Rock gets in persona, right, takes his shirt off, right, and he's flexing and doing all the lines and jumping around, and you guys are just stoked. This is just your dream come true, right? Fine. All right, so now, as this is happening, you barely even notice, but this little cave that you've snuck into for lunch is starting to fill up with water, right? Now, it's just a little trickle at your feet at first, but you don't want to disturb The Rock, right? So you just let him go on with his brilliant show, just great stuff. But you notice where the entrance is, right? That water is starting to fill up quite a bit, right? So here we are, right? Now, after a little bit of this, you can see that The Rock is getting a little tired, so you say, all right, guys, let's go, right? Rock, if you didn't notice, but back down there, it is kind of flooding in the front of the cave, so let's get out of here. Good? Now, what has happened? Sorry, I'm such a dork. The problem is that The Rock leads your expedition up out of the cave, but he is all flexed and swollen now, and so it was a tight fit at the beginning, but now he's so swollen that he gets stuck on the way out of the cave. Now, if you look, he is fine because he's halfway out of the cave before he gets stuck, but now behind him, it's created kind of this cork, right? And so now the cave is filling up with water. He's going to be okay. You guys are in some real danger of drowning. He's trying to relax as much as possible, but his muscles are just huge at this point. Oh, I can't drop. Okay. What should you do? Now, by the way, just by sheer accident, right, the film crew who is filming this little expedition just happens to have a handful of sticks of dynamite in their crew bag. Let's see. So, here's the issue. It seems like you're down to two choices. Should we shove a bunch of dynamite under the rock and blast our way out of here, or should we let you and your friends and the movie crew all die? What should you do? Now, of course, you would say, if you just look at basic numbers, oh, this is a dozen people, you and your friends and the basic filming crew, and there's The Rock. So, of course, it's 12 to 1, so we should blast our way out of here. But, of course, that's not how this works. You have to think of the total sum of happiness being produced in the world if you only have these two choices. Now, so what do you say? Well, you're trying to figure out a way to do this calculation where you and your friends live, but it's going to be really tough. Because what do you find? Even though these rock fans and all these movies probably have very low quality happiness produced, it's millions of people that get a little tiny bit of happiness from the Rock being alive. And hearing about his death would give them, again, probably low quality and probably even short duration unhappiness. No offense, The Rock seems like a great little guy. Great little guy, what am I talking about? A great, decent guy and seems cool and all of that. But again, the numbers are against you. No matter how low quality and low duration this pleasure that people get from The Rock's future movies and hearing about his tragic death by being exploded by a bunch of a bunch of you and your friends, you would still see, obviously, you have to let yourself drown. He produces a lot more happiness in the world than you dozen folk in that cave. So sorry, you've got to save the rock. So what we want to do, let's try to be more serious, is for every moral theory we look at, we want to look at some standard cases, right? Look at some very basic moral questions and see how they would be answered by each moral theory. So what we're going to look at, we'll look at murder, suicide, lying, and abortion. These are cases that some of these authors bring up. So let's see how each of them would deal with each of these cases so you can get a sense of what kind of answers each of the different moral theories gives. All right, so now, let's first do this by going back to divine command theory. Remember, the overall tenet I brought up was that the divine command theory doesn't stand up as a good moral theory. It doesn't give clear advice. It contradicts itself a lot. Right? So just to go through it briefly. According to divine command theory, is murder wrong? Well, the Ten Commandments say thou shalt not kill, but there's genocide being commanded by God all the time. In the last video, I quoted a little line where God is commanding Saul to kill all of the Amalekites, even their animals, right? You get it. I mean, just atrocious stuff. Suicide. Does the divine command theory give clear advice here? Well, it never really says suicide is wrong. It does say that you do not own yourself, you belong to God, but there again are stories of suicide. I mean, Saul, go back to the story. Here's what's really crazy. Saul is commanded to slaughter every living thing among the Amalekites. Well, Saul doesn't, right? And so what happens to Saul later? Well, Saul is being defeated, and Saul commits suicide. And people say that this is the rightful punishment for him not obeying God when he was told to slaughter everyone. Anyway, fine. Are there other cases of suicide in the Bible that seem praised or at least aren't denigrated as wrong? Yes, there is. You could even say Jesus, in a way, was suicide. He let himself be killed, and he said he could have stopped it, or that's how it's read most of the time. Or, very famous one, Samson. How does Samson die? He uses his muscles to collapse the building around him to kill a bunch of people and kill himself. Sorry, but this is almost suicide terrorism. Do I know that all of these people were guilty that were in these buildings? Doesn't seem like you could say that. But Samson kills himself as a very ancient suicide bomber. Sorry. Suicide is there. Lying, even in the Abraham story that we talked about, Abraham deceives Isaac and says, where is the sacrifice? Because Isaac asks, and he says, God will provide it. Well, that's tricking your son, and that's deceit. Rahab lies to hide some spies from Israel. That's a lie, and she's praised for it. Let's see, abortion? Now, this one is tricky. But did you know that there is a verse that almost no one talks about in Numbers about what you are supposed to do? This is so insane. Is if you suspect your wife of cheating, you are supposed to go to the priest. He's going to make some bitter potion, and she's supposed to drink it, right? And now the story says, if she cheated on you, she will get very sick. Now, translating the Hebrew here, I do not read Hebrew, so I do not know this, right? But this translation is really tricky because it says she will get sick and her thigh will blacken and die. But there is a good sort of interpretation that says what it's actually referring to is if she's pregnant, she will get sick and abort the fetus that she is carrying if she cheated. Now, sorry, but that means that there is a story in the Bible that recommends abortion if someone committed adultery. Now, again, there is a lot of controversy about how to read what happens when she gets sick from this potion. But again, there is a chance that the Bible even there is promoting an abortifacient, or promoting an act of abortion. So, is it very hard to apply the Bible in a divine command theory sort of way to even these four cases we'll look at? Yes. All right. So let's go on to utilitarianism in these four cases. So murder. Now, each of these will pose some problem for utilitarianism, but let's look at them. First, murder. Does murder produce happiness or unhappiness? Does it produce pleasure or pain? And now you would see vast majority of cases, murder is going to be wrong because it produces unhappiness. But notice how that's a little funky, right? There's a little fishiness there because we could imagine, very rare, but we can imagine some cases where murder would produce the most happiness. What if it was a terrible person that produces a bunch of unhappiness in his life? We could say that, we could pretty much guarantee that murdering that dude would produce more happiness in the world and very little pain except for him himself, because everyone hates the guy and he produces nothing but unhappiness in his life. See, that's a little scary with utilitarianism. That's going to be a possible problem. Try the other one. Suicide. Is suicide going to be wrong in utilitarianism? Now notice, in this case, we are getting to the kind of subtlety that suicide should be considered with. Because we can easily imagine cases. Someone on their deathbed, they are near death and their life is nothing but pain and suffering. Utilitarianism would say, yes, they should be helped to die in the most painless way possible. And some of us, me, think some of these cases are morally right. So utilitarianism is going to be fairly subtle. Are most cases of suicide going to be declared as wrong according to utilitarianism? Yes. Teen suicides, right? Let's be serious, right? Veterans with PTSD are very prone to suicide. Is utilitarianism going to discourage these suicides? Absolutely, right? Now, are there cases where we are going to be in that gray area where we're going to have to really seriously consider unhappiness and unhappiness for all affected? Yes. But do you see, I do think suicide is one of those moral dilemmas that has this degree of subtlety, and I kind of appreciate utilitarianism being very subtle in trying to weigh out the pros and cons here. But again, you are a young person considering suicide? No. I and utilitarianism is going to say no, right? If we are trying to predict the future, we would predict the future and say your life very likely will produce a lot more happiness for you and others than ending it now. So, no. What about lying? Lying is going to be one of those trickier cases as well, because we would say vast majority of lies produce unhappiness. And again, it's not just your happiness. So you could say you're a teenager home late at night past your curfew. Should you lie to your parents? Utilitarianism is going to say in the long term, higher quality building relationships, you shouldn't lie. Now, are there going to be some tricky cases? Are there going to be cases where utilitarianism would say, yes, right, when your wife asks you how does she look in those jeans, should you lie to her? Utilitarianism is going to say yes. Now, we will talk about the lying cases with more detail when we get to Kant, but you get there's some subtlety. Are there going to be some cases where lying is going to produce the most happiness? Yes. So it's not some cut and dry case. Utilitarianism is subtle. You're going to have to take it on a case-by-case scenario. Lastly, abortion. What would utilitarianism say about abortion? Now notice, for the majority of cases, it would say, nope, that child should probably be taken to term because we are talking about a life full of experiences, potential happiness that life, if it's brought into the world, will bring for itself and for others. But is this again a subtle issue? Yes. Are there going to be cases where, if we're looking at this from a purely utilitarian standpoint, could we imagine cases where abortion would be recommended because it will produce the least amount of unhappiness, least amount of pain, and in that way promote happiness? Yes, you could imagine the usual cases. The usual cases people bring up that should be exceptions for abortion. Those are actually fairly utilitarian considerations. So there are abortion cases where a utilitarian would say, yes, that is the right option out of those options. So what are the problems with utilitarianism as a moral theory? I think we've already gotten some hints about what some of the problems are going to be, but let me organize it in the way Rachel's does in the article. So what we want to think about, to make this really clear, is to show two things. That consequences aren't all that matter. Right? Have you noticed that utilitarianism is saying how we judge the moral value of an action is by the results it produces in terms of pain, pleasure, happiness, unhappiness. And the other thing is, as Rachel's is going to say, happiness isn't all that matters, right? We're not just looking at consequences, and we consider other things besides happiness and pleasure to be worthwhile goals. All right. And these videos so far haven't been silly enough, so get ready for over-the-top just corniness so that you could make fun of these videos with your friends. All right, let's go. Happiness is quite obviously not the only thing we care about. Let's reference the story from Rachel's. Remember? In Chino, there are these cops. What happens, right? This lady, Miss York, comes in because she's been sexually assaulted. And these creepy cops with cameras, right? Thought she was really attractive, so they told her to get into all of these, sorry, but seductive sort of poses naked, right? Saying that they were trying to chronicle her abuses. And they got their little jollies off by sharing it with the other cops in the department. Now, problem. If Miss York never found out about this, right? She had that day of incredible discomfort and embarrassment as they're taking photos of her. But you could say, according to utilitarian calculating, that if she never found out about this, the joy that those creepy cops got from sharing her photos would have made up for the discomfort and embarrassment she felt that day. Okay, no, we don't normally think that. Some people's pleasure should not outweigh someone else's just complete unfairness and disrespect. We think other things matter as much as happiness. Things like trust, things like love, care, relationships, right? Fairness. We think other things should be considered. All right, problem one. Second, as we've seen already through this, is we do have to predict the future, at least try our hardest to apply this theory, and these calculations are just too difficult. For example, in the simple trolley problem, right? We don't know if our granny is going to produce more happiness than the toddlers on the train track. We just can't predict these things. Now, of course, the trolley one, that shouldn't be too hard of a decision. It's all terrible, but that one's pretty clear. But in other cases, we can see that, gosh, there's too much going on to really grab all these calculations, and most of us need our moral theories to be so intuitive that they become almost instinctive, instead of having to really think about all these different things eventualities that could happen just based on what we do with a Snickers bar. There's too complex. Next, I like this problem, but it does ask too much of us. I mean, if we are trying to be a very good utilitarian, notice, we are going to have to be heroes most of the time. Just eating a candy bar is going to have to make us feel fairly guilty because of all the other happiness it could have bought if we didn't eat it but shared it with other people who were unhappy. I mean, this asks us, for instance, here's a criticism in some of the literature. If you are going to have a birthday party for your daughter, you're going to have to think, oh gosh, this would bring way more happiness if I gave this party to some stranger, right, in a poor area. And so that's actually what I should do. My daughter's already pretty happy, and so you get these kinds of things. It, in a way, forces us to be heroes, which again, I love. I mean, the real life utilitarians in the world, like Peter Singer, I mean, they are really good people. I mean, they are very happy. They're not miserable trying to live up to this. But, I mean, the goodness in some of their actions, I mean, it's inspiring. But again, we don't think we should have to be heroes just to do the right thing. And that example especially brings us directly to another one. We do often have good moral reasons for preferring people closest to us. I mean, giving a party for my daughter, we would normally say, yeah, that's just promoting the relationships and the cohesion of your family and showing love to people. And so this idea that we should be completely disinterested in the way we weigh or consider people's happiness is pretty far from our normal human experience. We do encourage people to give preference to those closest to them, at least first. All right, I'm giving you what you want. This brings us to our last problem with utilitarianism, and this is the most common one you hear. The objection is the ends don't always justify the means. Just because your goal is happiness and you have a good goal doesn't mean you're always warranted in doing whatever it takes to produce that goal. We will call this the hospital waiting room problem. Okay, so, oh gosh. You are in a hospital waiting room and you're waiting for a friend and you have good news, so you're just trying to bide your time by getting in a chat with the people around you. Okay. So you ask the people in the waiting room what they're doing, how things are going, and here's what they say. Good? Hi, how are you doing? What are you doing in here today? Oh, me? I'm here to get a cornea transplant. She's a cyclops, get it? Sorry. Right? Otherwise, I'll have to quit my job helping street kids. Oh, darn, I hope you get your transplant. And what about you? What are you in here for today? Good. Well, I'm here to get a kidney transplant. If I don't get one soon, I'll have to close the orphanage I opened in Romania. Oh, gosh, I hope that works out. And what about you? Well, I'm here to get on the wait list for a heart transplant. If I don't get a new heart soon, I will have to shut down my ranch for abandoned dogs. Oh, gosh, I hope that works out. You guys all seem like really good people. Sir, what about you? Oh, me? Nah, I'm not sick. I'm just here to see about getting these eye wrinkles smoothed out. I just left my third family. Don't worry, my lawyers are going to screw over those bratty kids and that old wife. I just need to become a new me if I'm going to catch a new hottie. Hey, are you guys thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah. Let's kill that guy and harvest his organs so that some better people can bring more happiness into the world. Yeah. All right, you obviously see that yes, according to utilitarianism, something like killing a douchebag to harvest his organs would be the right thing to do if you can do it in the right sort of way. Now, how might a good utilitarian respond to these sort of objections? Well, the first one, pretty common, is to say, these kinds of counterexamples in Jeff's silly examples aren't actually going to produce the most happiness. If you consider the long-term effects of these kinds of outlier scenarios, they're not going to produce happiness. I mean, for instance, right, killing someone to get their organs, right? I mean, I love the scene, but that is not going to produce long-term happiness because as we see these events happen, we are all going to be nervous. Oh, what if I'm going to be killed because I'm too healthy? And so this is going to have repercussions. So these kinds of counterexamples, when actually considered for long-term happiness and the happiness of a society and its need for laws, I mean, the creepy cops with cameras even, we would say, these sorts of things in the long term aren't going to produce the most happiness because people are going to have to consider such things. The second response that we can combine with the first one is that if we simply adopt a strategy of utilitarianism that is called rule utilitarianism, where you find basic rules to follow and these rules produce the most happiness, we can include things like fairness as a consideration when we think of producing the most happiness. Because these rules that produce happiness, right, like not killing people to get their organs, should be an obvious rule that tends to promote happiness, and so these considerations could be added in. Third response is a fairly radical one, and then I'll get to my own kind of defense. The third response is the one that we find at near the end of the Rachel's article. So let me read what J.J.C. Smart says. Quote, admittedly, utilitarianism does have consequences which are incompatible with the common moral consciousness. But I tended to take the view, so much the worse for the common moral consciousness. End quote. Let's continue what Rachel says. Our moral common sense is, after all, not necessarily reliable. It may incorporate various irrational elements, including prejudices absorbed from our parents, our religion, and the general culture. Why should we simply assume that our feelings are always correct? And why should we reject a plausible, rational theory of ethics such as utilitarianism simply because it conflicts with those feelings? Perhaps it is the feelings, not the theory, that should be discarded. This is a good point. I mean, when we're judging moral theories, the best way to judge them isn't just by saying, oh, I disagree with that view because I have this different view about abortion or the death penalty or suicide. We need to combat it with a better moral theory. Now, notice, just because our moral intuitions say, hey, we shouldn't really worry about some stranger's birthday, we should always give preference to our daughter, doesn't mean those intuitions are necessarily good. Maybe we need to correct a lot of our basic intuitions and feelings about morality, and utilitarianism could provide the right sort of corrective. Again, with some nuance. So that brings me to my fourth. Because I would say utilitarianism is well-intentioned moral theory, but it does need to be supplemented with something else. Maybe rule utilitarianism is enough, but I would think that those rule utilitarianism elements are easy to put together if you just combine this with a little bit of the moral theories we'll look at in a little bit. Care theory or Kant's theory. If we could be 95% utilitarian, but then just double check we're not killing people in a hospital waiting room by making sure it basically passes a Kant or a care theory test at the end. Do you get the idea? So supplement this view and you've got a good moral theory, but the problems require some kind of supplement because you've seen the problems.